Welcome to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. Today, we're going to talk about practical ways to make your own homegrown national park. I think nature's on everybody's mind these days. The news cycle is filled with the latest natural disasters, the latest political battles between preservation and resource extraction. We're all understandably concerned about how weather is going to affect our homes, our jobs, and how much longer our food systems are going to survive. Here on the Climate Hour, we understand that there's a natural balance between plants and animals, and we understand that in many ways, humans have upset this balance. Deforestation and factory farming, fossil fuel extraction, and industrial manufacturing. These are examples of humans replacing nature with artificial systems. Let's face it, humankind doesn't have a great track record of working with or being part of nature. Yet each of us individually can have a positive impact. We can work with nature and create our own park-like preserves in our yards and communally in our churches, schools, and workplaces. We can create our own personal oases, often with less effort and expense than maintaining a suburban lawn. We can help restore the natural balance between plants and animals and create our own homegrown national parks where we can live and work in balance with nature. We're joined today on Zoom by Dr. Douglas Tallamy. Doug is a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He's been teaching for over 4 decades and has authored well over 100 research publications. Doug advocates for home gardens and landscaping that bridge the gaps between parks and preserves by providing habitat for native species. Among his awards are the Garden Club of America Margaret Douglas Medal for Conservation, Tom Dodd Jr. Award of Excellence, and the American Horticultural Society B.Y. Morrison Communication Award. He's authored 4 books, Bringing Nature Home, Nature's Best Hope, The Nature of Oaks, and his latest, How Can I Help? Doug is the co-founder of the Homegrown National Parks movement. Hi, Doug.
Yeah, that was a great introduction, Bob. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. You know, you've been teaching wildlife ecology for decades. I mean, it's been a lifetime of service. What brought your focus to native landscaping?
Well, a bit of a story there. Of course, I was born loving nature, so no trick to that. I studied entomology in college and in graduate school. Got my job at the University of Delaware in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology. But I studied insect behavior for the most part. I spent a lot of time on insect parental care, on how cucumber beetles choose their mates. Interesting things, but nobody really cared about them. In the year 2000, my wife and I moved into our current property in Oxford, Pennsylvania. It was 10 acres of a farm that had been broken up into 10-acre lots and had been mowed for hay before we moved in. But it was out of mowing for 3 years before we actually built our house and moved in. And of course, when you mow for hay in southeast Pennsylvania, you're mowing the rootstocks of all the invasive plants that are there. So it's multiflora rose and autumn olive and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and on and on. So when you stop mowing, that's what comes back. Mowing does not kill those plants. So when we actually moved in, we had 10 acres of impenetrable invasive thicket. I had to cut trails just to be able to walk through the property. And it was that change from typical suburban yard into that habitat that changed the direction of my research and my focus. First thing I noticed is that our insects are not eating those plants. Now, this didn't surprise me because we learned about host plant specialization in graduate school, 20 years earlier. How can an insect from North America become adapted to the defenses of plants from Asia? It's not going to happen. So I didn't think it was news to anybody, but it was a good research opportunity for undergrads to come to our house and measure insect use of native and non-native plants. And there was a young lady who wanted to do just that. So I said, well, the first thing I want you to do is go to the literature and see what's already been done. A couple of days later, she came back. She said, I can't find anything. I didn't believe her. So I went to the literature and I looked, and there is a big long list of why invasive plants are not such a good idea. But wrecking the food web wasn't on that list. And I said, whoa, this is a research opportunity. So I wrote a couple of grants. to actually look into this. I got those grants, which tells me my peers weren't thinking about it either. And that is what changed the direction of my research. When you load the landscape, either accidentally or purposely with plants that do not support the food web crashes. And you can see that in the current statistics. We've lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years, 22% decline in butterflies just since the year 2000. Global insect declines. So all the data pointing in the same direction. We're taking away the base of the food web, where we live, where we work, where we farm, where we play. And what's exciting to me is that we can put it back. We can turn that around. This is not irreversible. And that's exactly what we did on that 10 acres. We got rid of our invasives, we planted the native plants, and I've been counting the species that have come back over the last, it's 25 years now. And it's a lot. It's a lot. I've been photographing the moth species that I find, and I'm up to 1,364 species that I've photographed on that 10 acres because we put the plants that they need back. So it's encouraging. It's reversible. All I want to do now is get everybody else to do it.
Yeah, that's exciting. It's interesting how just a yard, or in your case, a few acres, can make such a big difference. I know I moved into a suburban house too many years ago, a traditional Kim lawn type environment, and took a couple of years removing all the grass, putting in, native grass, native bushes, trees, and such, and it really changed my living environment. So I know what you're saying. It is such an effective way to have a positive impact on, our health, our home, and the planet. So this whole idea of native versus non-native, can you talk more about that, and the food webs and biodiversity?
Sure. Of course, plants are what allow us to be on this planet. They are capturing energy from the sun and they turn it into food through photosynthesis. They're taking that energy and locking it up in the carbon bonds of simple sugars and carbohydrates. And that is the food that drives just about all the animal life on the planet. Well,
Including us.
including especially us, yeah. It only helps animals if you get that food from the plants to the animal. And it turns out most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that eat plants. Most of those invertebrates are insects, particularly caterpillars. But they're very fussy. Caterpillars are very fussy about which plants they can eat. They're fussy because plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they protect their tissues with a number of types of defenses, but mostly phytochemicals, nasty chemicals, things like nicotine and cucurbitacins and cardiac glycosides and cyanide. Those are all plant compounds that have evolved to protect plant tissues from herbivores, including insects. But insects do eat plants, and they do that by over eons developing the adaptations necessary to get around those chemical defenses. This is why the monarch can eat milkweeds. Milkweeds are really well defended. They're full of cardiac glycosides and sticky latex sap, but monarchs have found ways to get around those. But in doing that, they haven't spent any evolutionary time finding ways to get around the defenses of oaks or asters or anything else, which means they're locked into eating milkweeds. We've got over 2,000 genera of native plants in this country, and monarchs can only eat one of them. That's called host plant specialization. And it works really well as long as you have that one genus around. And 90% of our insects are host plant specialists. And that's the problem. When you allow plants that evolved elsewhere to displace the plants that evolved right here, then the insects that depend on those plants disappear as well. They can't eat the plants that evolved in Asia because they haven't had the opportunity to adapt to them. And I'm not talking about a few years. I'm talking about thousands and thousands of generations to do that. I forget what the question was.
We were
Oh,
talking
that's the
about
native plant.
food webs and
Sure,
biodiversity. I mean, let's
sure.
look at the biodiversity. Why is that so important?
It is biodiversity that runs the ecosystems on our planet that create what we call ecosystem services. That is the life support that keeps us and everything else around. We have this notion, we've been so detached from nature, we have this notion that we don't need it. But we do, whether you live in the middle of Manhattan or Beijing or Iowa, it doesn't matter. We all need ecosystem services to exist on this planet, which means we all need healthy ecosystems that are chock full of biodiversity because that's what creates those services. And research has shown over the decades that the more species in an ecosystem, the better it performs, the more stable it is, and the more ecosystem services it produces. So we say the more productivity is produced by that ecosystem. So
I assume it's,
when you take species away from that ecosystem, then you lose that stability and you lose that productivity. And that's why biodiversity is important. Everybody, whether you love nature or not, no matter where you live, requires it.
we have so many different environments around the world. I mean, different temperatures, different water levels and such. I can see biodiversity because each niche is going to need its own specialized agents, animals, plants to live there. And if we don't have that diversity, certain parts of the world are just going to collapse because there's nothing that can survive there.
Which is why we need functioning ecosystems everywhere, not
Mhm.
just in parks and preserves. I mean, parks and preserves, great. They're all the biodiversity is huddling within those, but we need it everywhere because we are everywhere.
Mhm. We talk about food webs. I have the impression you're talking about the animals, the insects, the birds feeding on each other, but I assume that food web expands into human food systems too. I mean, agriculture and such.
Right, of course. It wasn't that long ago that we were hunter-gatherers and we gathered lots of types of plants, roots and nuts and fruits, and we hunted animals. We had a very diverse diet. That was, of course, harvesting the productivity of those ecosystems. Our diet's much more narrow now. We depend on really just a few major crops, corn and wheat and soybeans and rice. That's about it, which is, it can be precarious. But all of those are produced by nature as well. Those huge mega farms depend on healthy topsoil. It depends on benign weather systems that provide just enough rain, just enough sun and warmth. And of course, we're fiddling with that, and that could be a big problem. But a food web, I talk about food webs as opposed to food chains because let's take a single plant. Let's take horse nettle. It's not one creature that eats horse nettle and one creature that eats that creature and so on. It's not a chain. There are a number of things that eat horse nettle and then a number of things that eat them and parasitoids and diseases. So it webs out like a spider web very, very quickly. So the accurate term really is a food web. You can remove little parts of that food web, but at some point you remove things that make the entire web collapse.
I'm assuming that mowed lawns are going to be non-native in most areas. What are your thoughts on today's suburban lawn culture?
Sure, our lawns are built from cool season European grasses, just a few species. They all require the cool season conditions that are common in Europe. We brought them over here. There are four ecological goals that I talk about that I think every landscape has a responsibility to meeting. Every landscape needs to support pollinators. And we used to talk about we need pollinators because they pollinate our crops. We actually need pollinators because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. A few of those are our crops, but it's not just about our crops, it's about life on Earth. Every landscape has to sequester carbon for obvious reasons. A third of the carbon that's in the atmosphere right now has come from us chopping down the forests and plants on this planet. We can put a lot of them back. We really can. It's not going to solve the problem, but it certainly will help. Every landscape has to manage the watershed in which it lies, and every landscape has to support a viable food web. If you don't have a viable food web, you don't have the animals that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. That's what every landscape, no matter where it is, should be striving to do. And every landscape manager should have those things in mind. Lawn doesn't do any of them. And that's why I pick on it a lot. It's aesthetic. I mean, yes, we can walk on. It gives us space, gives us a sense of safety because we can see our enemies coming. But ecologically, it's a disaster. And we've got 44 million acres of it. That's really the disaster part. A little bit of lawn's okay, but 44 million acres, that's an area bigger than all of New England combined. Um, so I don't recommend getting rid of lawn. I do recommend reducing the area you have in lawn.
Okay. Okay. And, lawns in terms of climate hour, we tend to think in carbon sinks. And
Yeah.
obviously, plants are carbon sinks. I mean, they build themselves out of the carbon dioxide removed from the air. They're reducing greenhouse gases. Part of our climate crisis right now, it has been the deforestation, the movement to lawns, just the reduction of plant mass around the world and its ability to scrub CO2 from the air and replace it with oxygen. I know we talk about food systems. Obviously, plants feed everything. All of our amino acids come from plants. Whether we're eating the plants or whether they're feeding the animals that we eat. So there's that. But then all of our oxygen comes from plants too. If we lose our plant systems, we can't breathe. We can't eat. We can't breathe. That's how important they are to us, our food systems, and our atmosphere.
It's a good
So
example of why ecosystem services are not optional. Oxygen's
yeah,
not optional. We need
it,
it.
it is not optional indeed. So I understand the whole connecting native plants with the insects that are paired with them. I mean, it's a symbiotic relationship. They have to coexist or neither one exists. What about the bird populations? Why are they important to us?
I get the question of why, why are houseflies important? Why is this species important? Why is that species important? All the species are important. Again, we want to build the species diversity of our ecosystems as much as we can, at least to what they used to be. Birds are right now, they're the charismatic megafauna that's left in most systems. Not very big for the most part, but they're obvious. A lot of them are beautiful. We like birds. And they do important things. They disperse seeds, extremely important seed dispersers, important members of the food web community. So losing our birds, it would not be a good idea. What are most of those birds eating? It during reproduction, which of course is the most important time for any bird's life history. Most of them, 96% of terrestrial birds in North America are rearing their young on insects. And most of those insects are caterpillars, those fussy things that are only eating particular plants. And I'm not talking about just a few caterpillars. I'm talking about thousands and thousands to make one nest of a bird. We always talk about the chickadee, Carolina chickadee example, because there's good data on it. But it takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of a bird that's a third of an ounce to the point where they fledge. And after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days, but nobody's counted that. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars necessary to make a little bird. And we don't want one little bird. We want a whole community. We want all kinds of species of birds. So imagine the number of caterpillars required to drive bird food webs, which is why we need the plants that make those caterpillars. And things like
So,
crepe myrtle and ginkgo and burning bush and all these things that we landscape with don't make them.
so obviously we need the plants and the insects to feed the birds. I also perceive that the birds are keeping the insect populations in balance.
Yes, major predators of insects.
Yes.
People complain to me. I do talks and I show pretty pictures of caterpillars and say, I can't find any of these caterpillars, especially in the springtime. I say, of course not. The bird has already eaten that caterpillar. So yeah, extremely important in terms of keeping things in balance.
There's that word again, balance, being in balance with nature. Um, what about other wild animals, small mammals and such? When we talk about native landscaping in our homes, what impact is that going to have on these other animals?
So many of those animals also require insects. Shrews, for example, they're insectivores. They're eating insects almost exclusively. Many of our rodents, which are very important components of food webs, we don't like mice, but they're really important out there. They're eating insects along with seeds. The meso vertebrates that are out there, the raccoons, the skunks, the foxes, 25% of a fox's diet is insects. 23% of a black bear's diet is insects. If you are a sharp-shinned hawk, You're not eating insects directly, but you're eating the birds that needed insects to become birds. Same thing with a garter snake. You're eating the toads that needed insects to become birds. So a world without insects is a world without biological diversity. And of course, a world without biological diversity is a world without humans. So insects, Dan Jansen, famous ecologist, has called caterpillars, for example, the bread and butter, the meat and potatoes of terrestrial food webs. Everything depends on them.
Absolutely. So the small animals are tied in just like the birds and the animals. When we have that native landscaping, then our yard basically becomes a full ecosystem, not just a lawn.
The goal is to get your yard to contribute to your local ecosystem instead of degrading it. And right now, the standard landscape contributes very little.
Indeed. What about food plants? When we talk about native landscaping, and there's a lot of movement. We talk a lot about food systems here on the planet because they're so important to us. But there's a lot of movement to urban farming, permaculture, those kind of things. When we talk about native landscaping, is there a role for like fruit trees and nuts and berries? Do they play a role in our native yard?
They can, they can. You can make elderberry jelly. You can harvest the hickory nuts and the walnuts. You can harvest acorns. Human populations, particularly in the temperate zone, lived off of acorns. It was a major food source for thousands of years. But it's a lot of work. They weren't watching TV or playing with their iPhone. They were soaking the tannins, and it was a lot of work to live off the land. And we can do that. There's an interesting book by Elsmith Hay just came out this summer that is suggesting we need to go back to the particularly the nuts that trees produce that supported human populations again for thousands of years. And when I first I saw the title, I think that something like "Trees Will Feed Us." I was very skeptical, but she convinced me. She said that this our mega farms of corn and wheat are so destructive to the planet, and they're not very healthy for us either. So increasing the percentage of um, what's corylus filberts, really
Mhm.
important source, and then of course the hickories and the walnuts and so many other things really needs to become a much bigger source of food, of protein and fats in our human diets. And she outlines ways we can do this. So it's very, very exciting. I hope it really catches on.
I think there's a balance. I know in my yard, I like to have some fruits and nuts, like you say, the filberts and such. And I'm not a person that wants to spend a lot of time in my yard, so it's not like I'm maintaining orchards. But
Right.
that one fruit tree, or the berries growing more or less wild back in the corner, I can supplement my food with that, and it's a nice addition to what I get from the store or the farmer's market. It's interesting when you talk about this because I remember when I was a kid, and I'm not that old, but not that long ago, the backyard would be filled with butterflies and honeybees and fireflies, the evening dusk and all the fireflies. I
Right.
just don't see that anymore. You go out into the backyard and it's kind of barren.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about, isn't it? The non-native plants that have driven these insects away.
The non-native plants are reliant on pesticides when we don't need them. Neonicotinoid seed coatings. It doesn't increase yield at all, but every crop has them. Only 5% of that material is taken up by the plant, and the other 95% washes off or blows away. Where's it washing off and blowing away to? Fireflies they're predators as larvae in leaf litter. What do we do with our leaves? We rake them up, put them out at the curb as if they're garbage. And so we're sterilizing the landscape in a way that doesn't support the things we grew up with. I remember chasing those fireflies 5 years old. It was a great time. And our kids don't get to do that now.
Yeah, I had a friend. I just spoke with a friend last week, and they took a road trip across Kansas from Missouri to Colorado. And the thing that they said they were surprised that they didn't have to once wash bugs off their windshield, and that surprised me. I remember traveling across the Midwest, and the bugs would just smash into your windshield coating. I mean, you'd be rushing to the next gas station so you could clear your windshield. And
Mhm.
apparently that doesn't happen anymore. You can travel clear across the length of Kansas and not run into a single bug. That really struck me. That's scary. That is such a huge, that's not just my backyard. That's a huge shift in the environment.
You know, the road verges of our agriculture, and if you think of the Midwest, it's thousands and thousands of miles of roadsides that cut through all of the corn and the soybeans. It used to be, quote, weeds, which was milkweed and New York ironweed and goldenrod. It was all the native plants that sustained monarch populations and our native bees. Well, somewhere along the line, we got the idea that we should spray Roundup right up to the road, kill all those weeds, and plant grass. So it's a double disaster because it eliminated a tremendous amount of biodiversity. That is what has hammered the monarch more than anything else. And now that grass has to be mowed. I mean, so they're putting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Again, the good news is we can reverse that, and some growers are actually starting to do that.
You're listening to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. We're speaking with Doug Talamy about practical ways to make your own homegrown national park. So let's talk about creating our own homegrown national park. I mean, how do our listeners identify native plants for their specific yard?
Well, it's easier now than it ever used to be with all the apps on our phone. If you really don't know what a plant is in your yard, there's an app associated with iNaturalist. It's called Seek. Simply take a picture of it and of the leaf. If you have a flower, that's even better, and it will give you suggestions of what it is. And that's for native or non-native. It'll tell you what it thinks that plant is. There's all kinds of resources that you can Google and turn up the common native plants in your county, in your state, and all kinds of picture books. Lots and lots of resources out there. And if any of those are too difficult, take a picture of it and send it to me. I will tell you what it is.
You may get inundated here. You may not.
Well, that's okay. That shows interest. So yeah, it's the knowledge required to actually do this is easier to acquire now than ever before.
So these apps and these books and stuff, they're going to automatically know where you live, or do you have to identify a zone or an ecoregion or something like that to start?
Yeah. We have developed a wonderful tool on the National Wildlife Federation website called Native Plant Finder. And it operates by zip code. So you put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the most important woody and herbaceous native plants in your county will pop up. So right away, you know, these are plants I should attempt to get into my yard. Now that depends on how big your yard is. And for some people, your yard is a front porch, but you can still do native plant gardening in containers. And that's also on our website, homegrownnationalpark.org. What are the best native plants that do well in containers or balconies in your ecoregion? So again, you go there and all of a sudden you know what is going to survive in a container in my ecoregion, and it's not a mystery anymore.
Mhm. Yeah, technology can be wonderful in some ways. Um, I'm curious how ecoregions are determined. Are they, I mean, they're looking at weather patterns or, rain, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, temperature, rain, altitude, latitude. Um, some of them are quite large, and there are different levels of ecoregion. So ecoregion level 1 is really too general to be very useful. It's almost all of the eastern United States, and of course, there's lots of variability in the eastern United States. But it can go. I think there's ecoregion level 7, where it's very particular,
Wow.
and you can see exactly what ought to be planting where you live. There's a really handy tool in California called Calscape. In California, the California Native Plant Society has geo-referenced every population of native plants in the state. So we know exactly where they're growing, which side of the mountain they're growing on. California is hard because there's so many ecoregions, so many, it's a huge state and a lot of relief in that state. So knowing where you live and the plants that belong there is a really handy tool to identifying the appropriate plants. I wish every state had a Calscape, but they don't.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds like a great tool. Let's talk a little bit about the impacts of native landscaping on climate change. That's kind of our focus here on the climate hour. I know that the more plants I have in my yard, the more carbon I'm removing from the atmosphere. Are there apps or are there tools that would give us a sense of how much carbon a given landscape is actually removing?
There are, at least with trees, there's something called iTree, where I don't know if you take a picture of the tree or you just type in the name. They want to know how big the tree is, but it will tell you the amount of carbon it will sequester in a given period of time, depending on the species and the location. Very powerful. I don't think we have such similar tools with prairie plants, for example. But there's really interesting studies that have shown that an acre of Midwest prairie, tall grass prairie, is going to sequester almost as much carbon as a mature forest because they have really deep roots. And those roots are pumping carbon into the soil. The carbon is being stored in the soil as opposed to the plant itself. Um, and there's a rapid growth rate every year. So that's one of the reasons those soils are black, because of all of the prairie plants that were there for thousands of years beforehand. That's carbon in the soil. So if you live in an area that doesn't support all that many trees, that's okay. Get those prairie plants into your yard, and those deep roots will be sequestering carbon. So much better than your lawn that has roots of about 2 inches thick, and then you mow it every week, releasing any carbon that it sequestered. So
And when you talk about prairie grasses, I assume you're letting that grow to maturity, letting it reach its
right,
head.
right. You're not mowing that.
You're
You
not
do
mowing
you
that.
do meadows or prairies require a disturbance periodically. It used to be fire. The Native Americans burned on a regular basis, or grazing. When you have several million bison eating those plants, it sets them back. We've removed those sources of disturbance, so we have to replace them one way or another. And it's either mowing occasionally or fire.
Mhm. Are there other direct non-climate benefits to native landscaping? And I'm thinking things about changing the quality of the air or, even indirect benefits like fighting stress. What does native landscaping do for us there?
Yeah, plants, both trees and herbaceous plants, are removing pollutants from air. There's a number of studies showing the benefit of getting the trees back in our cities so that it cleans up the air. But the most fascinating research, I think, has been showing our physiological responses to exposures to nature. And some of them can be really simple. Some of them can be looking at a picture. But walking in an area where there are trees lowers your blood pressure. It reduces your cortisol, your stress hormone. Um, and when we reduce stress, we do everything better. We learn better. We're nicer. We don't get divorced as often. More of our kids go to college. There are interesting studies of people, and I think it was Chicago, living in projects where they all were planted with trees originally, but one set of apartment complexes cut the trees down, the other didn't. And they compared sociological measures in those two apartment complexes. And the differences were amazing. Crime goes down. People worry about, oh, the bad man's going to hide behind a tree. Well, the bad man's not there when there's a tree there. It's just a better place to live, and that's been repeated time and time again. So, real physiological benefits to even moderate exposures to nature.
You talked a little bit about prairie grasses versus trees. I mean, are there different types of native yards and do you approach those differently?
Well, this is where you live is important. If you're in the east, most of those ecoregions get enough rain that it wants to become a forest. So if you want an eastern meadow, and there were eastern meadows, because they were repeatedly disturbed, primarily by the large Pleistocene mammals just a few thousand years ago, and then humans kept them open with burning. But if you want a meadow in the east, you have to work to keep the woody plants out, both the invasive plants, but the natives come in regularly too. So that's a little bit more work. As you move further west, You get into the Midwest, there's less rain. It's easier to have a prairie system. But again, we remove fire in the bison, and the eastern red cedar has come in. A lot of woody plants are coming in. So to maintain that prairie that used to be there, we need to there's a lot of inputs that have to happen. As you move farther west, you get into the Colorado, the base of the Rockies. That's a high plains, short grass prairie, and they simply don't get enough rain to support much woody plants except along the riparian corridors. So there, maintaining grass systems real easy because that's pretty much what wants to grow there. So
It sounds like your type of native landscaping is defined by where you live.
it is. It
I
is.
mean,
A
the
lot of
word
people
native, yeah.
Yeah, some people don't like that. I met a woman who lived in the sagebrush community of Eastern Oregon, and she had moved up there from Florida or something. I don't know why she was there, but she said, "Oh, I want to get rid of all that and put in other plants. I don't like them." I said, "Well, you should move back to where you came from because those are the plants that will do well there." And putting a plant that needs to be watered every day into a desert ecosystem, just we do it, but it doesn't make any sense at all.
We're talking a little bit about the benefits of plants and stress and those studies. I've also seen studies, and we were talking earlier about the benefits of birds. I mean, say populations and they're pretty and stuff like. But I have seen studies talking about the impact of birdsong on stress levels.
Yeah.
So, another benefit to that ecosystem in your yard. I'm curious.
The apparently the connection there is not only did we love the song, but it's a signal that there aren't any predators out there. The birds get quiet or they get angry when there's a predator around, but when they're singing happily and defending their territories and mating, that's a signal that it's a safe place to be. So we like that.
That is interesting. So our native landscaping depends on where we live. Has there been any look at global warming in general? I mean, we're far enough into the cycle. I've seen reports where we're seeing plants migrate north, where we're seeing the small mammals migrate north. So in a way, our native landscaping is evolving as the planet warms. Have you had any contact with that or any research that you'd like to
Well, I've
share on that
seen,
subject?
yeah, I've seen those studies as well. I haven't done any myself, but yes, things are. It's a little tricky because on average, the globe is warming. There's no doubt. But what's really happening, particularly in North America, is that the jet stream that used to wander across North America, and above it was generally colder and below it was generally warmer. It did wobble, but now it's gone crazy. Huge fluctuations in the jet stream. And when it goes way north, then it's unusually warm up north. But when it goes way south, it's unusually cold. The migration of plants north is not as steady as people think because you get those cold snaps that kill them. Last year, in Baton Rouge, there was 9 inches of snow and it got down to 9 degrees. In recorded history has never been that cold. And it killed even native plants that were down there. So the wild swings in our weather are not making that migration as steady as people think. But generally, plants are moving up mountains. We did some hiking in Washington State this year, and there's a little mammal called the pika that lives up in the talus, and we saw six of them, and I was so happy about that because they live above the tree line in the huge rocks, and they can only go up so far. So and they don't want to be warm. So if it continues to warm, they get to the top of the mountain, and that's the end for them. So I was pleased to see they were doing well. Um, but that's a concern for things that are isolated in mountains. The mountains are only so tall, and we don't want it to get too warm for them.
You touched on four ecological responsibilities. Go through that again. Summarize what our responsibilities are.
The responsibilities I talked about of landscapes, of course, we're managing those landscapes, but to sequester carbon, support pollinators, support a food web, and manage the watershed in which you lie. There's a house down the street from me that has, I don't know, 4 or 5 acres of lawn. That is destroying my watershed. Now, he doesn't know that. He's not thinking about that. But it creates stormwater runoff. He's adding pollutants to the watershed. That's not managing the watershed. So those are the four things that I think every homeowner who is the land manager, either directly or you hire somebody, has to keep in mind.
So talk a little bit about keystone plants. What is a keystone plant?
Keystone plants are the ones that are supporting the most biodiversity. That was one of the things we discovered in our lab that it surprised me. I mean, it used to be just a dichotomous argument: native not as good, or native is great, and non-native not as good. But it's not that simple because there are native plants that support very little as well. They're really well defended, and I could build a 100% native landscape that supports very little because of the plants I chose. So it turns out when you look at particularly caterpillar host records, that just 14% of our native plants in North America are supporting 90% of the caterpillars that drive those food webs. So if you build a landscape that does not, and those are the ones we call keystone plants. If you build a landscape that doesn't include any of those, you're going to struggle to make enough caterpillars to support that chickadee and the other things that want to live in your yard. So that's an important piece of information in terms of landscaping because you want to make sure you have those powerful keystone plants where you live. And it changes a little bit as you move around the country. But in 84% of the counties in which they occur, oaks are the number one keystone plant. So in most parts of the country, choose an oak and you're going to be a winner. Now, in the Pacific Northwest, there's one species of oak, the Oregon oak, and you get up in the mountains and it's Douglas fir, it's conifer. So you got to put them in the right place. But in most places, until you get up into Canada, oaks are kings.
So your keystone's typically going to be trees
Trees in general support more species than do
or
herbaceous.
diversity.
But you
Okay.
can divide keystones the way you want. If you want a keystone plant for pollinators, there we talk about the most specialized pollinators that it supports. Just like those caterpillars that can only eat particular plants, 30% of our native bees, and we've got almost 4,000 species of native bees, can only reproduce on the pollen, particularly the pollen of particular species of plants. So if you landscape for those specialist pollinators, you're landscaping for all the pollinators because the generalists can use those plants as well. If you only landscape for generalists, you've lost your specialist pollinators. And this is where it gets a little confusing because a lot of our non-native flowering plants do attract pollinators, particularly honeybees, which are also non-native, but they attract a number of butterflies. They've got nectar, and the insects go where the nectar is, but they don't attract the specialist bees. So if you have a 100% non-native flowering landscape, you will lose 30% of the bees that could be there. And that's a big hit on the pollinator diversity. So we say, why not plant the plants that are going to support all of the bees instead of just some of the bees?
So I'm sold. I want to go native landscaping. How do I approach my homeowners association?
You build a landscape that they're not going to object to. Homeowners associations, we developed this idea that we're gonna be a high status neighborhood, and we're gonna protect that status by making rules, and that's what the homeowners association does. No rusty cars in the front yard. We're gonna be classy citizens, and it kind of got out of hand. Now they're saying, well, everybody has to have identical landscape. The grass can only be a half-inch tall, and we're gonna look like a golf course. And in some places, those are the rules. But what they're trying to do is protect the status of that neighborhood. They're trying to protect the property values. And native landscaping has gotten a bad reputation because people think, well, native means wild and messy. It can, but you can have wild and messy non-native too. And I've got pictures of 100% non-native landscapes that were not cared for, and they're a total mess. So you're really talking about how the landscape is managed. You can reduce the lawn, but the lawn you keep is going to be mowed. It's going to be manicured. That's where you walk. You can do that in a way that your homeowners association won't. They don't know a native plant from a non-native plant. They do know neat and whether or not you're fitting in with the culture of your neighborhood. So what you want to do is design a landscape that is not going to reduce property values, and that's easy to do. I've got all kinds of pictures of really formal landscapes, 100% native, but nobody would know that. So if enough people provide the models, then homeowners associations, they don't care. You're still within the rules. It's not native versus non-native. It's really neat versus non-neat.
So you're still maintaining, you're still trimming the edges of the sidewalks, those kind of things, just, the open areas, maybe prairie grass or trees or bushes, whatever.
We talk about using lawn as a cue for care. So one mower's width of lawn along the driveway or the sidewalk. You can have well-planted areas behind that, but that usually is enough to convince people, okay, this is intentional. You are taking care of it. You are a high-class citizen. It's okay.
That's a good approach. I assume the same thing for city codes. If it's neat looking, the city's not going to come and cite you for something.
Yeah. It's usually one person who complains about your landscape, and then you get a citation. And there are rules on the books that say, well, if your plants are more than 3 inches tall, it's going to attract rats or vermin. Nobody can even define what vermin is, but rats are in sewers. They're eating our garbage. They don't eat native plants versus non-native plants. So ignorance has driven a lot of these unnecessary rules. And I can happily say that many HOAs and townships are relaxing these rules. They're getting enough. There was a couple in Maryland that sued their HOA. There was a headline in the New York Times, I fought the lawn and the lawn lost. And the HOA lost. So now there's a legal precedent that HOAs cannot tell you how to landscape. But I don't want to sue anybody. We want people
No,
to do
no.
this voluntarily and recognize that there are real benefits to going native.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've been talking about our lawn and our homeowners association and such. What about some of those other green areas, our schools, our churches, maybe our workplaces? How do we as individuals or as small groups of individuals, how would you advise we approach them about native landscaping?
Yeah, the parks in our cities. When you have a bigger landscape like a school or a church or a park, there's usually one guy who's maintaining that, and he's doing it on a mower. And so lawn is the easiest thing to mow when you have large areas. So you have to think about the maintenance of that property when you're suggesting changes. But there's a woman, Naomi Edelson at the National Wildlife Federation, who's working very hard on changing the way we landscape our places of worship. Um, I get emails all the time of people pushing their elected officials in their townships or their even major cities, San Francisco, for example, to increase the percentage of natives that are in their public spaces. So it's really happening all over the place. These headlines that people see, the loss of 3 billion breeding birds and global insect decline, they're disturbing to people. My message has been we can do something about it. And that empowers people. So, particularly when you're dealing with elected officials, you just have to make it clear that this is an important issue and they will not be elected again if they ignore it. And then believe me, they will take that to heart and act
Yeah,
on it.
yeah, that's definitely a motivator. So tell us about your homegrown national park movement.
Well, we do have parks, we do have preserves, they're scattered all over the country, but we are in the sixth great extinction event that the Earth has ever experienced. So obviously, their intention is good, but it's not enough. What's between those parks and preserves? It's our private property. 77% of the entire country is privately owned, and 85% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. So it's private landowners that are going to be the future of conservation. What we need to do is essentially put the plants back in between those parks and preserves, create viable habitat connecting those parks and preserves so that it's not no man's land anymore. That increases their size. Small preserves are they bleed species over time because the populations within them are tiny, and when they fluctuate, they disappear. So the object is to make those areas bigger, whether they're officially designated as preserves or not. And the way to do that is to transform our our private properties. So and by we I mean Michelle Alfandari and myself created Homegrown National Park. Boy, I don't know, 4 years ago now. Time flies. And the goal was we're not creating another conservation organization. We don't charge to be a member. The goal was to kind of be a hub of information to we talk about reaching the non-choir. The people who already know this stuff don't need another organization. They know that they have to act. But there's over 300 million people in this country that don't have a clue that we've got a biodiversity crisis and that there's something they can do about it. So we want to reach those people. That's why we built our organization, Homegrown National Park, to help create a movement to actually change the culture into one where conservation is important. If you belong to Audubon or National Wildlife Federation or Sierra Club, it's great. You're still a member there, but you're going to join Homegrown National Park by registering your property and the area on that property that you're going to be a good steward of. This gives us a mechanism and you do it on the biodiversity map. It gives us a mechanism to track how we're doing. If we cut the area of lawn in half, that gives us more than 20 million acres that we could re-landscape. How are we doing towards that goal? So you go to our website, you register where your property is, the amount of area you're going to be a good steward of, even if it's just putting an aster in a flower pot. And then that's it. You're a member of Homegrown National Park. You get our emails, our letters, our different motivational schemes. But the website is loaded with information about how to do this, resources. Where do you get your plans? Who can help you do this? And that's what it's all about. And then your little piece of your property lights up with a firefly on the map. And you can see who else, not who particularly, but how many other people in your county have joined Homegrown National Park. We want the whole country to light up with a firefly. That's our goal.
That sounds great. Tell us a little bit about your books.
Well, my first book, Bringing Nature Home, came out in 2007. I wrote it in 2005. And it was interesting because I told you we started doing research on our property about insects using natives and non-natives. Bird clubs started to ask me to give talks. And then they said, we want to read about this. We want something to read. Well, a couple of years went by. I said, there's nothing to read. We haven't published the papers yet or anything. So kind of as a self-defense, I wrote Bringing Nature Home so that, there's something you can read. And I actually thought, well, that'd be the end of the talks because people can read all about it. Didn't work that way. So I didn't think anybody would read it, but they have it, and they continue to read it. That book is still selling today, almost at the same rate it did 20 years ago. Then I waited a while because I didn't have anything new to say until we had a lot more research, and the situation actually was getting more and more dire. So I wrote Nature's Best Hope, trying to get people to accept the responsibility. You are nature's best hope. And if you don't accept that responsibility, we're going to lose hope, But there's a lot of us out there. I wrote The Nature of Oaks after that because my wife said, you should write a book about oaks. So I said, all right, I will. And what it does is talk about the nature, the living things that use oaks every month of the year. So you can go out to your oak tree and you can say, all right, this ought to be out there. Is it out there? It's kind of it was really a fun book to write. And then finally, how can I help? I get emails all the time asking me good questions. And these are from people who've already read my other books and have already heard my talks, and they still have really good questions. So after a while, I started to save the answers that I wrote to these people and put it all together. And we actually submitted under the title of Next Steps for Nature, but Timber Press changed it to How Can I Help Using My Yard to Save Nature, something like that. But it's 499 questions that people have asked me and their answers.
And thank you, Doug. Thank you for joining us today. Where can our listeners go to learn more about your work?
The single most informative website would be homegrownnationalpark.org. So that's all one word, .org.
Well, thank you.
Appreciate,
And thank you.
appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Great talking to you. Thank you to our listeners. We welcome your questions and feedback. You can learn more about the Climate Hour at climatehour.net. That's climatehour.net. This is the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove.